About has been God's dream, and it's basically been a study of certain ideas that spring out of the second and third chapters of Genesis. I guess I would call Genesis 2 God's dream. It is a description of God's intent in creating man. And I suppose if you want to make an overview statement of what God's intent is, it is to give man himself. It is to make a creature who is given freedom and who in that freedom chooses always fellowship with God, and as a consequence to receive from God all that God has to give, which is all the happiness there is and all the blessings there are. No blessings or happiness come from any other source. And in a sense, if you want to look at it sort of poetically, God's intent is that man should always be in Eden. Eden, the pleasure garden, the symbol, I think, of all that man could possibly want. And it is interesting, isn't it, when you come to the book of Revelation and you get the description, imagery recurred. That's saying to us, I think, that God now will bring us back to the place in which He placed us originally. Chapter 3 is God's dream shattered, and focuses in the idea of free choice. I do not know why God made man free to choose. I know the answers that you preachers give and that I give when we're asked by our congregations, and I think that's a part of the answer, but that certainly is not all of the answer. I do not know why God made man free to choose. Nor do I think that you can make your way to some obscure corner of Scripture and find an answer there. I used to think you could. Somewhere, as Fred Craddock says, in the backside of Habakkuk, or in some out-of-the-way place, there is a passage that explains that. But I don't think Moses knew. I don't think Paul knew. I don't think any New Testament or Old Testament writer knew, and that's why you're not going to find an answer. I do not believe the Bible answers every question. It answers every question that we need to have answered for our salvation, and that should be enough. So I don't know, but He did. And I know that because I know that I am free to choose. And that in the choices I make, many of them are wrong. A few of them are right, many of them are wrong. And all of that is traced back in the third chapter of Genesis to the first use of the capacity to choose. The first use of that capacity to choose to say no to God. I think there was freedom before, but the freedom had always been used to say yes to God in every context. And now that freedom is used upon the suggestion of the serpent to say no dominant ideas. You can be like God, knowing good and evil, and you can't trust God. He's looking out for His own interests. He really isn't concerned about you, and all of that business. So what we talked about yesterday was some of the consequences of the abuse of free will, what happened because the dream was shattered. These are things that are the essence of the sin itself, and they are things which are the consequence of the sin. And the ones that we talked about yesterday were, first of all, the suggestion by the serpent that you can't really trust God, you can't depend on Him, He is not reliable, and so you... The second one, which I think is really central in chapter 3 and verse 5, is the temptation to human beings to set up on their own and to be their own bosses. You can be like God. What an offer. Did you ever hear an offer that was more attractive than the offer to be like God? And she bit. The third thing that we suggested was the nature of temptation and the fact that Eve is walking around the tree and she's looking and she's thinking, no, I shouldn't, but wouldn't I like to? And he said I shouldn't, but he said I could. He said that he said, you know, and you can't trust him, and should I trust him, and all of this. And finally she reaches out and plucks the fruit and she eats it. And it was a delight to the eyes, and it could make you wise. And so we discussed here the human proclivity every day and in our own lives to choose short-term gratification, or as someone suggested, instant gratification rather than long-range benefit. And this is the kind of thing where we berate ourselves afterwards. How could I have been so stupid? But we just keep right on doing it. The thing that we got to last time, right at the end, as we consider other consequences or facets of the shattering of the dream, is the fact that the idea of obedience in this story in Genesis 3 is not taken seriously. Obedience is not taken seriously. It's something that will be done, but maybe we don't always need to do it. And we talked last time briefly about the whole perspective that at least I have sensed in the last few years toward obedience. We did not like that word in the 60s because it reeked of the 20s and 30s and 40s and preaching that said you better do this or else. And we were now liberated and we were becoming more spiritual and we understood the deeper things of the faith, and so now we are freed from the necessity of obedience. You remember that? And I can recall, you know, students who really weren't too big on obedience, but it was all right because their insight was so much greater and they were so much more spiritual than these plodding Christians who operate on the level of obeying commands. I think we survived that. And then we discovered grace. It's been around a long time, but we just kind of discovered it recently, and so we are kind of like some of the Gnostics back in the early century. If God's going to forgive anyway, then why is it so important to obey? Because God's in the forgiving business. God will forgive. That is His business. Isn't that what Nietzsche said? My perception wrong is that today in the church we do talk about obedience, and we are serious about obedience, and we want other people to be serious about obedience, and especially we want our kiddos to be serious about obedience. But if it really comes down to it and it is convenient to disobey, it's no big deal. So we've heard what the Lord has said about materialism, but we don't get too upset if we're a little bit materialistic. And it doesn't bother us a great deal if some greed creeps into our lives, or if we give in to lust, or if the occasion comes and we tell a lie, or if we buy into the cultural pattern which says, seek vengeance. Why do we love Rambo? Why do Charles Bronson movies attract us so much? You know, because it's the old get-even syndrome. So we'll do these things. We'll talk about obedience and preach obedience, but when it comes right down to it, you know, where you've got to make that decision, it really isn't too hard a thing for us to be disobedient. Am I wrong? Maybe I'm wrong about this, but it seems maybe I'm just reflecting my own psychology. Maybe I'm saying more about me than about anybody else. But it seems to me that there isn't that really powerful sense that this is God speaking, and one should be very careful about ignoring what God has said. That we just, I don't know, we've reduced God. Maybe it goes back to the whole business of doubting God. And I want to hear myself say, I will not do that. Or I want to hear myself say, I will do that. It involves considerable, hear those stubborn Christians. I want to hear myself being one of those stubborn Christians, not who affirm that they will avoid wrong and they will do good because they understand the necessity of obedience. It's a good word. Maybe abused, but it's a good word. That was the fourth thing, in case you're keeping track for the examination later on. The fifth thing is one that really fascinates me and that apparently is central in the text. The first thing that is said after she has eaten the fruit in verse 7, after we're told that the eyes of both of them were opened, which really is sort of an ironic way of putting it because they weren't opened, they were closed in a sense, is they both knew they were naked, or as we say in West Texas, naked. And it fascinates me that that theme kind of goes through the text here. Just look at chapter 2, verse 25. They were both naked. They weren't ashamed. You go down to make themselves aprons. There's a fascinating idea here to think about why God doesn't let the fig leaves, you know, put your clothes in put your salad in the trash. I'm going to make you better clothes. You go down to verse 10. They say to God, we heard you and we hid because we're naked. And God says in verse 11, who told you you were naked? And then in verse 21 of chapter 3, the Lord made for Adam and his wife garments of skins, and he clothed them. I think now we're moving from the nature of the sin itself to the consequences of the sin, and so I've pondered this. They were the same way before as after. They were a cappella, without accompaniment of clothing. And yet, that condition of nudity, which is no problem in the end of chapter 2, after Eve has eaten the fruit in chapter 3, verse 7, is a problem. And I've asked myself, what new element has been introduced because she ate the fruit that wasn't there before, that changes her perspective and her husband's perspective toward the fact they haven't got any clothes on? And as I've tried to analyze that, the new thing that has come in has basically been self-centeredness, making yourself your own God. So that now she is concerned about herself primarily and not about God primarily, and now she sees the world through those glasses. Everything now is seen through the spectacles which say, I am God. So that they see their sexuality through those glasses, and now sexuality, rather than a thing in which they engage with the primary relationship being their love of God, now it is a thing in which they engage, or which they might potentially engage, with their primary theme being love of self. I do not believe that some kind of sexual violation was the original sin, as some would suggest. I do ask why the text focuses here on this particular aspect of it. It seems to me you could say that they saw something else selfishly, and that was the problem, but we focus on the sexual aspect of humanity. I think one reason is because the first people who read this material were the Israelites going into the land of Canaan, where the prevailing religion is a fertility religion, and where fertility in religion involves sexual intercourse as a way of encouraging the deities to have sexual intercourse so you'll have a good crop. So that Israel in the land is constantly subjected, I think, to a kind of high-pressure sexual temptation which they had not experienced during the wandering. I think that's one reason why it's there, but I think another reason why it's there is because God understands the terrible irresistibility of this impulse. I have a good friend to whom I talk occasionally who is probably one of the finest Christians I know. I mean, he's not a good Christian, he is an outstanding Christian. Everyone I know says this about him. And one day as we're talking together, he talks to me about the terrible difficulty he has dealing with sexual temptation. And how difficult it is for him to see attractive women and not to have the wrong kind of thoughts. I would never have thought it. Looking at his exterior, looking at the way he deals with life, seeing his values, I would never have thought that lurking within his mind are these problems. I wouldn't have thought that about you either, looking at you, or maybe you about me. But it's here, I dare say, in every one of us. And we all have our secrets. There are a lot of things you might stand up and confess to other people, but there are some things you will never confess, and my guess is that they have to do with sexuality. And that there in the dark recesses of our hearts we entertain those secret fantasies which we certainly are not going to put on the screen for everyone else to see. And so we pick up on those things that deal with the sexual self because those things are of great interest. You want to know how to get a room of people quiet quickly? Bring up this subject. Because we're all dealing with it. Every one of us. Even those people of whom you say, not that person. You're just looking at the outside. You don't know what's the inside. And so it's appropriate that this issue, which I expect for most, if not all of us, has produced throughout life incredibly difficult inner turmoil, maybe sometimes breaking out into external actions that are wrong, that all of us appreciate the fact that we have this here in Genesis because we know how difficult it is. And what bothers me about this is you never hear it talked about in church. I had a class on campus at ACU a couple of years ago on Wednesday nights. It was an open forum. Kids could come and ask any question they wanted. And one night we got into a discussion of sexuality, and when it was over, I said, how many of you have heard this discussed in church? And about a fourth of them had. One of the most difficult problems we face, and we're so prudish we don't talk about it. You know, and so we just ignore ministry to a incredibly significant area of human experience where the impact of Christ needs to be brought to bear. Selfish sex. Sex in which one is interested only in one's own gratification, an experience in one's own body, or perhaps an experience in one's own psyche. I understand that in the case of a man it may be primarily an experience within the body. In the case of a woman it may be an experience with the body, but also a psychological kind of experience. Not being able to speak for those of the feminine persuasion, I'm not sure if that's true or not, but I think it is. Sometimes people lie and pretend to be interested in more than just the immediate sexual gratification, the selfish use of sex. And so you have people, I think women in particular, who are victimized by men who come and present themselves as being genuinely interested in the entire person. But once the sexual event has taken place, it becomes very obvious that the gentleman was telling a lie and making promises which were insincere and which he never hoped to fulfill because he was concerned about the selfish use of sex. I remember the woman on, I don't remember the lady's name, who was the predecessor of Dr. Ruth, the current sexual guru. But this lady who did that sort of thing on television, a very attractive 40-ish lady, gray-haired, and she was interviewing another lady one day, and I recall that the other lady who was also rather attractive, early 40s, divorcee, desperate for love and affection, telling the story about meeting a man in a bar, I suppose, and the man showed great interest in her, and she thought, this man really cares about me, he wants to know about me, he's interested in my personhood. And she made her mind up very early that if the man wanted to sleep with her, she would sleep with him, and because this man wasn't out to use sex selfishly. And so they went home together, and to her home, I guess, and they slept together and had sexual relationships. And the woman said to the man, how do I know you really are interested? And the man said, I will tell you this. I will go to work tomorrow, but when I get off work, the first place I will come is here. I will go straight from work, come straight from work to your house. And the woman waited all day long for that moment, because here is a man who cares about me. And 5 o'clock came, and 6 o'clock, and 7 o'clock, and he never showed up. And she was talking about that on television, devastated, because she had been told, you matter to me, but she had really been the victim of selfish sex. Man got what he wanted. He said what he had to say to get what he wanted. It is, this selfish use of sex overlooks the fact we are humans. It reduces us to the level of beasts. It isn't concerned about the psychological aspect, the spiritual aspect. It really isn't concerned about love. One of the great ironies is that we use the term making love for one of the most loveless acts in which we engage in our culture. And so anyone who's a victim of that feels about as cheated. Now, how would you feel if someone treated you like a worm, or a cow, an animal? That's what's happening, the selfish use of sex. C.S. Lewis has said that when a lustful man roams the streets saying he wants a woman, that is the very thing he does not want. What he wants is a particular piece of apparatus which will allow him to fulfill a need. And when he has used the apparatus to perform the function for which he intends it, he is willing to discard it. And then he says, who keeps the cigarette wrapper once all the cigarettes have been smoked? You know anyone that collects cigarette packages? They crumple them up and throw them away. how would one feel, whether man or woman, to have been used and then discarded? What greater assault on our humanity is there than that? And I would hasten to add, as we discuss this particular aspect of the destruction of God's dream, that I'm not talking about extramarital sex alone. Somehow we feel that because we are married, this selfish use of sex never occurs. But I would suggest that there is selfish sexuality within marriage in many ways which are destructive of the marriage relationship. And I don't know all the ways that that happens. I think sometimes that men in marriage are just like animals. I remember seeing the Loretta Lynn movie. What was it called? Pardon? Coal Miner's Daughter, where she marries her husband, and the first romantic sexual interlude or experience is in the back seat of the car, and it's virtually rape. And that happens in marriages. But I think equally reprehensible is the wifely use of sex to get what she wants. Okay, I'll give you this if you'll give me this. And that's wrong. This is not a counter that we use in some kind of game. It is a giving of two people to each other. And these are all the husbandly rape, the use of sex to get what you want. These are two of the many ways in which the same thing that happened here happens in a contemporary society, the selfish use of sex. First time I read what C.S. Lewis said about sexuality in Mere Christianity, you've read it, many of you. Lewis suggests that as a consequence of the fall, our sexual impulse has been perverted. And that what we normally consider what we today consider the normal use of the sexual impulse is not normal, it's abnormal. And he argues that because he says the sexual activity is far in excess of its function. Its function, he argues, is to produce new human beings. But if a healthy young man produced a new human being every time he had sexual activity, he'd easily populate a small village in 10 years. Talk about population explosion. I don't know if Lewis is right. I pondered that. He also says that he thinks the sexual instinct has gone wrong because there are such terrible sexual perversions which are so bizarre and are so hard to cure. And then in his book, Out of the Silent Planet, as he is looking at Earth from Mars, he sketches there a society in which I think he is saying this is how the sexual impulse might have been had it not been perverted, and you have a society in which there is anticipation, and then there is actual sexual activity for a few years, and then there is reflection on it. And he's saying maybe this is the way it would have been. I don't know, but the more I think about it, the more I wonder if maybe one isn't forced to admit that something has gone terribly wrong with the sexual impulse, and the way it works today is not the way it was intended to work. And if it's tough enough in itself, and it is, to deal with, it is made incredibly more difficult by a society which has realized there is great commercial advantage in sex. And so you sell everything through sex. You know, all you have to do is watch television to learn that. And you saturate movies with sex because those movies have lots of people to come to see them. And if you're a popular entertainer, you make a book about sex and sell it for $50 and don't let people peek at it when they go in the store, but they have to look through a peephole and pay $2 to do that, just to even look at the book, to see what it looks like. The cure, real love, selfless love, and submission to God. I think that if you will talk to people who are married and who genuinely love each other, they will probably tell you with regard to the sexual instinct that it cannot be satisfying unless there is the sense it is satisfying to both. If my husband is not happy and if my wife is not happy in this act, that somehow I'm not happy. Even though the physical experience may have been there, it is a shared experience. So it fascinates me that in Genesis 3, with the smashing of God's dream, that one of the basic things that's mentioned is is the sexual aspect of man. It's obvious I'm not going to get through all of these. If I could buy back some time, Lagarde, from you, then I've already insulted you before you came in, but I'm sure that everyone will share the insult. Well, you'd have been here earlier, but the previous speaker spoke so long. I know, and you weren't able to get there. The next thing I want to talk about, which is a consequence, comes from verse 10. He said, I heard the sound of thee in the garden, and I was afraid. This is a man who, when he says, I'm afraid, is saying, I've had an experience here I've never had before. I suppose he had to invent a word for it. This feeling of wanting to get away from God, this sense of aversion to God, has triggered within him emotions or whatever that have never been his before. There's no fear in the garden before this. There's no fear in perfect relationship to God. Perfect love casts out fear. If you're afraid in your relationship to God, if there's still fear there, then there's growth that needs to be made. There's nothing to be afraid of in perfect fellowship with God. Now, we experience some fear because of sin, but there was no sin previously in the garden. And we now are people whose lives are baptized in fear. You say, no, I'm not afraid. Yes, you are. I'm not afraid of, you're afraid of a lot of stuff. You're afraid of the bomb. You're afraid of war. You're afraid of people who are different. We've had a number of them mentioned this week. You're afraid of, if you're a backpacker, you're afraid of Lyme disease. You're afraid to go out in traffic. You're afraid someone's going to rob your home. You're afraid that you're going to get cancer. You're afraid that you're going to have a heart attack. You're afraid of being lonely. You're afraid of the fact that the ozone layer is depleting. You're afraid of the fact the forests are being destroyed. You're afraid of spotted owls. You're not afraid of a spotted owl. You're afraid we're going to lose our forests. You're afraid we're going to lose our jobs. You're afraid of immigration. You're afraid of bad stock market. You're afraid of monsters. You're afraid you'll be unattractive to the opposite sex. You're afraid of bad breath and termites and a losing season and tooth decay and fire and tornadoes and earthquakes and floods. And you can just go on and on and on. All the fears that we have. Afraid of Claude Guile. I mean, a lot of people hate to see Claude coming because they're afraid. Claude, just sit down, don't say anything. You're afraid Claude's going to ask for money. You're afraid to see Sam come. He's going to ask for money. Yeah, you ought to be afraid you don't give any money. And advertisers bank on this. You know, the advertisers remind us that our breath smells bad in the morning and the home may break up because you turn to your mate and say, hi, and the mate says, hey, I've had it. No more. I'm not going to wake up another morning. Have to deal with that sort of business. And political candidates. You've seen Ross Perot and his charts? Fear. Well, Bush is doing it too, and Clinton's doing it, and the vice presidential candidates are doing it. They're all doing it. You need to be afraid. So we live soaked in fear. Just make an analysis for one day of all the things that you're afraid of. There are a lot of them. And they were afraid because they sensed a breach with God, and they sensed that in trying to set up on their own all of these things they have enjoyed in the presence of God are no longer guaranteed. And now the only things they have are the things they can get in their own, and maybe they realize their bankruptcy and realize that Eden is not something that they can assault and they can get for themselves. It's something that's gift, and now having rebelled against him, they no longer have a guarantee of that gift. We are afraid because we're insecure about the future, what's going to happen tomorrow. I feel great today, but I don't know about tomorrow. We are afraid because we do not have one. And the cure for this is the confidence, I think, that God is God, and faith in God, and belief in God's control. I'm hearing a lot about that. I'm hearing a lot about fear because of what's going to happen to Columbia Christian, but I'm hearing a lot about faith. We need not to live in fear, but we need to live in faith and believe that God can do what seems to us to be impossible. So this is another consequence. I'm going to mention 3 more. We won't have a chance to embellish them. Not embellish, develop. Pardon me, I used the wrong word there. There may be more consequences. It seems to me that another consequence of what is done here is that human beings are unable to accept responsibility. And then a consequence beyond that is the home relationship is damaged. This whole business of this week has been talking about family. You want to go back to where family problems began. They go back to where the man says it's her fault. And the woman says, it's not my fault, it's the snake's fault. And so you see a perfect relationship between husband and wife, which has existed previously, is now ruptured, and they become enemies. Have you ever lived in a home where the husband has his lines over here, and the wife has her lines over here, and they have their heavy artillery lined up, and the marriage is a matter of firing across the lines? Who's going to win the war? Home, there comes a day when they say to each other, look, we're not enemies. We have been acting for all these years like we're enemies. We're on the same side. And even nature is corrupted, it seems to me. That nature quit working the way it was supposed to work. And if you look at the curses, maybe prior to this time the serpent was not meant to be in enmity with the woman and all of that. And before this time, I would presume that any childbearing that went on was painless. But now it doesn't work the way it was intended, so there's pain in childbearing. And before this time, any agriculture would have been accomplished without the curse of weeds and all of those things which make it difficult to grow things from the ground. But now nature doesn't work anymore. Let me talk a little bit about the first one, the inability to accept responsibility. It would amaze you, I think, if you began in Genesis and went through to Revelation and made a list of all the places where people pass the buck and they do not accept responsibility, to see how many of those there are. Every time some large firm is accused of some serious ecological violation or of an inferior product which has injured people, something's wrong with the car, or something's wrong with the chemical, or something's wrong with this product that's sold, this drug that's sold, what do you hear from the company which was responsible for that? Oh yes, we're guilty. We goofed. Is that what you hear? No, you hear stonewalling. You hear denial. You hear an absolute refusal to acknowledge guilt and responsibility. Now maybe that's done for legal reasons, but that if people do something wrong, they deny it. They will not admit that they've done something wrong. But it goes even beyond that, I think. I received a copy of a speech 3 or 4 years ago from an ACU graduate named Billy Wilbanks, Dr. William Wilbanks now, who is one of the leading penologists in the country. And he had been invited back to his hometown in Killeen to give the baccalaureate address to the graduates. And he sent copies of this, and it was about the greatest American heresy. And he said the greatest American heresy is the tendency not to accept responsibility but blame someone else for what you've done so that you are no longer culpable. You know what I'm hearing more and more and more? I think there's something to it, but I'm hearing it a great deal. When someone does something wrong and you begin to examine why they've done it, we come up with, well, it's not really their fault because they're a victim of child abuse. But my guess is if you want to stretch child abuse to the limits, maybe we're nearly all victims. I got my share of spankings. That could be called in some definitions child abuse. There was no question my parents loved me. I always got the speech afterwards, you know, that it's hurt me more than it hurt. Yeah, sure, I know, yeah. I did it for your own good. Yeah, of course, yeah. But that's why I'm so wonderful today, because Dad did all those things. As if to say, you know, it's not my fault. Our house was robbed last March. Well, under counseling, it was learned that this person was a victim of child abuse. As if to say, well, she really couldn't help it. You're no longer responsible for your sexual misdeeds because you have a lust addiction. And anyone who has an addiction obviously is no longer responsible because the addiction controls them. So like an alcoholic. or a person who is a drug addict, since you have an addiction, then you are relieved of all responsibility. Bring something in. It's the old Flip Wilson, the devil made me do it, but now it's become more sophisticated, and it's not a joke. And that's why I said yesterday, how many of you are teachers? Because all teachers have had this experience. A student makes a bad grade, and they come around at the end of the semester and come into your office and just give you down the river. It is your fault. You're too hard. I couldn't understand what you were saying. I couldn't take notes. I couldn't pass your tests. I don't know what the problem was. I tried. I studied. All this kind of stuff. It's your fault. I finally had one kid come by, and I just absolutely lost my composure and said, look, buddy, let me show you where your grade is on the scale. Let me show you what other students did in this class. You're way below the others. Obviously, something's happening with you that didn't happen with them. Don't blame me for your problem. Now, I may lack a lot as a teacher, but when people come and say it is my fault, they flunked the course when I've done everything I could to jack the grade up and help them in every way, I'm not buying that. I'm not responsible. It's their fault, not mine. Evasion of responsibility. So what we have in the 3rd chapter of Genesis is a terrible time, the greatest of all tragedies. God's dream is shattered. What will happen? What's going to happen is it will get worse before it gets better. Read chapters 4 through 11. And the theology of those chapters is that what happened in chapter 3, as bad as it was, keeps getting worse. There is a murder. Cain kills Abel, and then you have Lamech, who practices revenge. And then we have a passage, a puzzling passage in the first of chapter 6 of Genesis, where the sons of God marry the daughters of men. But I think the theological import of that passage is to say it gets worse and worse. It continually gets worse. And if it means that the righteous line marries the wicked line, then the wicked line prevails. And every thought of man's heart is wicked continually. And then the earth is wiped out, and we make a new beginning with 8 people. God destroys the earth, as if God says, I'm going to try this thing all over again. I'll wipe them out and start anew with 8 righteous people. And he does. And now we have the Tower of Babel, in which it's even worse than it was, because it's no longer individuals doing wrong, but it's wrong in concert. People together are doing wrong. It gets worse and worse and worse. And God continues to be gracious. Adam and Eve do not die immediately. They are given skins to cover them by God, and they are allowed to go, and they live longer, and there is grace. And when the world gets so wicked that men always think evil and the flood wipes them out, there is grace because 8 people are saved. But when the Tower of Babel occurs, there is no grace. Their tongues are confused, and there is no grace in chapter 11 corresponding to what happened at the Tower of Babel. And so we might say it looks like God has given up. He tried, he made them, they messed up, they messed up, they messed up. God wiped them out and started over. He's given up. And then we hear a voice say, Abram, and we know there is grace. And that word Abram gives us a foundation. Genesis 12, 1 through 3. And the superstructure is built on that until we come to the great act of grace in Christ. And God is saying, whatever you do to shatter my dream, I will go one step more to rebuild it. And I think that's a good place to quit. Shall we pray? Thank you, Lord, for these sessions together, and we pray that through your grace and power that they can enrich us and strengthen us and provoke us to think the right kind of thoughts that will draw us more closely to your side. Help us to understand the magnificence of your love and of the calling to which we are called. And help us to respond to your love with love ourselves. Forgive us and help us to overcome. Help us to know that you never give up on us. We pray through Christ.